It is Tuesday, May 29th, 2018, and this is Seahawks Chats with Kenneth Arthur and Rob Staton this week. So you could call it a 3,000 NFL mock draft. Listen, you know we're going to talk about the Seahawks and we're going to talk about young players, but we're starting off because it is May the 29th. May Brandon Marshall be with you today as the Seattle Seahawks signed Brandon Marshall to a one-year contract worth up to $2 million. Essentially, the Seahawks had a need at receiver for someone who was a bit more experienced, a bit bigger, and could bring something to that unit that they were lacking after losing Paul Richardson, as well as Jimmy Graham and Luke Wilson, some of the experience in terms of Russell Wilson's receiving targets, and a low cost. And on the other hand, some people would say that it is a move for a player who, because he's not what he once was and because he doesn't have a likely future to get better at this point from where he was the last couple of years, some fans have concerns about the allocation of resources and roster spaces and this sorts of things with regards to Brandon Marshall. But we'll get into why the move makes sense, why it doesn't make sense. Rob, we'll start with you, as I have to, as you're the only other guest. You're the only other person here right now. But the Seahawks signed Brandon Marshall 1 year, $2 million up to. But, in all likelihood, if he makes the roster, there's a long way to go before any of that. And even if he hit the $2 million, it would be really good for the Seahawks, I would assume, if he hits $2 million, or at least fairly good. Rob, what are your thoughts on the Seahawks signing of Brandon Marshall and what it means for the rest of the receiving unit?
Well, I don't see any negatives personally. The fact that it is just a $2 million deal signed at a time when value is available. Look, someone's going to get Michael Kendricks, a linebacker, at a pretty cheap price in the next few days. Someone's going to get Des Bryant eventually down the line on a pretty cheap deal. And the Seahawks have decided they're going to sign Brandon Marshall. Now, I understand some of the complaints. He's 34. He's not going to be the Brandon Marshall that played so well against Richard Sherman in 2016. What a battle that was between Sherman and Marshall. We're probably not going to see that version. We're definitely not going to see the version in Chicago and Denver when he was at his best. But there's very minimal risk involved in a deal like this because he comes into camp, and if he doesn't beat out Amara Darboh, and if he doesn't beat out Stringfellow and the rest of this crew at receiver, then you cut him. And no harm done in having a look, in the same way that there was no real harm in looking at Terrell Owens in 2012. And I see the argument. Someone tweeted me earlier today saying that the risk with this is that everywhere he's been, there has been problems in the locker room and he's a character risk. Well, what I would say to that is, if that proves to be the case, I'm sure the Seahawks will move Brandon Marshall on pretty quickly. This has been an off-season whereby the Seahawks have been gearing everything to having a very different and more competitive dynamic in that locker room. And if they see any issues with Marshall, they're not going to stick with him, and they don't have to as well because of the contract. They can just cut him. Terrell Owens didn't have an adverse effect on the Seahawks 2012 season. They moved on from him. They signed Antoine Winfield in 2013, cut him before the season began, didn't have an adverse effect on the locker room at all. They've done this before, so they get a chance to bring somebody in, and the best case scenario is one of two things. I think there's probably two really good scenarios here. And one is that Brandon Marshall looks really good and therefore wins a role. It's probably a niche role, probably more like third down conversions, big target, red zone type of thing. And he makes the team. Or the other best case scenario is that his presence on the field elevates the performance of someone like Amara Darboh, who suddenly feels out of his comfort zone. Brandon Marshall's there competing for my job. I've got to make sure that I win that job. It takes the comfort zone away from someone like Tanner McAvoy or David Moore, that these players are going to have to go out there. They're going to have to beat out one of the most productive wide receivers in the last few years in order to win a job. And I think those are two really good scenarios. The only negative is that this just doesn't work out. They cut him before the season begins. And they could cut him next week if they wanted to. I mean, I don't see the potential risk of this. Anything about the age and the injuries and the character can all be disposed of very, very easily because he's on a $2 million deal. And the other final thing I'll say about this is that I don't really have any of those concerns because Brandon Marshall, I looked at the numbers in terms of what his earnings are throughout his career, and he has made apparently $79,211,648 through NFL contracts. That's not including all the endorsements that he's had and all the TV appearances and everything else, and any other ways he's had of making money over the years. So this doesn't seem to me to be a guy who desperately is in need of $2 million or whatever his contract is with the Seahawks, may even be less, that he actually properly earns. There might be some incentives involved in that $2 million. So money doesn't seem to be a motivating factor here. It seems that the motivating factor is that he wants one last chance. He wants one last shot to come to the NFL, compete, win a job, try and win a championship, maybe get that achievement of winning a Super Bowl ring before he eventually retires. And, you know, a motivated Brandon Marshall, who has been one of the most competitive receivers in the NFL in this sort of era of NFL football, I think that this only can be a positive thing. So I think it's a good move by the Seahawks. I'm very interested to see what he still has left in the tank.
And like Rob, if we move down the roster too, because you mentioned Amara Darboh, and for the Seattle Seahawks offense, you know, there's going to be so many changes between going from Darrell Bevell to Brian Schottenheimer, going from Tom Cable to Mike Solari, you know, losing Jimmy Graham and Paul Richardson, switching out, you know, the offensive line coming into the season with Dwayne Brown at left tackle rather than getting him for the second half of the year. Some of the other changes and additions that'll be happening. But if you look at 2015, Russell Wilson's best season of his career, in fact, one of the greatest seasons by a quarterback ever, I would say. You know, he had Doug Baldwin, and Doug Baldwin was the forefront of that offensive attack, you know, with his 14 touchdowns and much of it coming in the second half of the year. Jimmy Graham missing the last 5 games of that stretch. They really were just going with Tyler Lockett, who is still around, and Jermaine Kearse. And Jermaine Kearse's role on the offense that year, you know, 68 targets, 49 catches, 685 yards. It's a good season by Kearse. He is and was a good player. Nothing special, though. And I think, you know, for Amara Darboh or someone like that, if you're looking at who can replace Paul Richardson, it's really just like, you know, not necessarily the next Paul Richardson if you put it into the same context of, hey, can we find, or can the Seahawks find somebody like Jermaine Kearse? And maybe that's where a Darboh or Brandon Marshall or a David Moore or so on could step in, and could someone just fill in those 50 to 60 targets and be, you know, efficient with, you know, 68, 70% catch rate, because Jermaine Kearse was very efficient at that time. But because you have Baldwin and Lockett in place, it seems like there are ways to move, but that only matters if Tyler Lockett improves and steps forward after taking seemingly 2 steps back these last couple of years. Very inconsistent player going into a contract year. What did you see from Tyler Lockett last year? What do you think you could see from him this year? Because I think a lot of the focus will be on, is Tyler Lockett going to take that next step as a receiver, or is he going to continuously be sort of a point of both excitement and frustration in the way that you may see a Ted Ginn or something like that?
Well, I think the one thing we have to remember with Tyler Lockett is the injury that he sustained was a horrific injury. When I've seen players, not in the NFL, but in soccer over here, suffer those kind of leg breaks, it's often that they don't even come back. So the fact that he came back as quickly as he did and still managed, I mean, he wasn't necessarily back to his 100% best last year, but the fact that he came back and produced what he did, I think is testament to him as a character and as a person. And I think the optimistic side of me looks at that final game against Arizona, sees the returns, sees a bit of the burst return as well, and makes me feel like that with an extra year and a bit more rest, a bit more recuperation, a bit more working to get back to his physical peak, that he can do that. And look, there are players that have come back from injuries and they've taken a year. I think that, having spent so much time covering Nick Chubb over the last year or two, he was not the same player pre-knee injury in 2016. And then in 2017, you start to see some of the old Nick Chubb return there. So I think that there's a chance that the same could happen for Tyler Lockett. He's had a year, he's got over the injury now, and that we might see him get somewhat closer to his best. But the thing I really like about the fact that you look at this receiving group, and it's the message that is sent throughout the whole team now, is that everybody has to try and win a job. There are going to be very few positions on this roster that you know who is going to win that job before it starts. And it's people like Russell Wilson, and it's Doug Baldwin, and it's Bobby Wagner, and it's Earl Thomas. But apart from that, you know, people are going to have to really compete for a job. Tyler Lockett's going to have to compete for his job. You know, Jerome Brown's going to be right up there, and Marcus Johnson competing for that sort of speedier, quicker receiver role. You're going to see now Brandon Marshall pushing Amara. If Mara Darbo makes the roster, he's going to have to win a job. And the same for Tanner McAvoy, and the same for David Moore, and the same for Demore Stringfellow. You know, there's real competition there. You know, Ed Dixon, they brought him in as a veteran. What if Will Disley proves to be the best tight end in preseason? You know, are they going to still start Ed Dixon? Are they going to start Will Disley? You know, is Dixon going to be the number 2? There's across the board on this whole roster, there is competition. That is what they want. Pete Carroll wants to reestablish his identity on this team. He wants competition. And you know what? When I look at the roster, and I've got it right in front of me now, I don't look at this roster in the same way that I did 2 or 3 years ago, where you just look at it and say, wow, this is a loaded roster. It is probably the most talented in the NFL. They've got a chance to win the Super Bowl just because they are the most talented team on paper. You know, it's often the team on paper that doesn't win the Super Bowl. When I look at this team now, I think there is competition there. This is going to be a bunch of young, hungry players. They're going to have a point to prove in preseason, and that's exactly how this team was built in the first place, because they had a point to prove and they won a job, and then they wanted to show the rest of the league why they'd won that job in the first place. And I think that's a really encouraging thing. Doesn't mean the Seahawks are going to win the Super Bowl this year or next year, but it means that it's almost certainly going to be a more like a Pete Carroll team this year, and it's going to be more interesting to watch.
For sure. And moving forward, the Seattle Seahawks, you know, they've signed Brandon Marshall, but they've got, you know, he's going to be, right now he is, I'm not sure, I don't have the number in front of me, but he's got to be, is he the oldest player on the team? I mean, he at 34, I struggle to think, you know, the only players close right now, Dwayne Brown, John Ryan, who likely, you know, there's talk of him not making the team because of Michael Dixon, of course. So one of the oldest players on the roster, but the Seahawks still trying to get younger, try to get players in there to, you know, sort of buy into Pete Carroll's system and philosophy and stories in the way that Michael Bennett and Richard Sherman and Cliff Averill claim to have gotten over it and tired of it. And, you know, there was all this stuff with Cliff Averill talking recently as he's sort of echoing the point that players lost respect, veteran players lost, you know, sort of respect, and they for Pete Carroll, and the same sort of thing over and over again, because they had been together for 5-ish years, and sort of just it was hard to buy into a new thing, especially after losing that game against the Patriots on a pass when they, you know, when they would I thought Marshawn Lynch in the run game and all this blah, 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 blah. But the Seahawks bring in new players. First of all, Rob, do you see much to hold weight with that sort of idea that with Pete Carroll these last, you know, few months, just sort of getting rid of a lot of the signs of the old Seahawks, you know, 2012, 2011 to 2016, the times that they were deep in the playoffs. How fresh do you think this 90-man roster will be when it's all said and done by the time they get into September, having do you think it'll be sort of a rejuvenation of those first couple of years of Pete Carroll? Or do you think Pete Carroll's success and the identity of the entire organization is such and so well known now that nobody's really going into it without some idea of what they're getting into?
No, I think there's a chance that it's going to go back to what it was, and it's going to be a little bit different because there's always going to be people who were there for the first go around. So, you know, Russell, Bobby Wagner, Earl Thomas is still here, and KJ Wright. So that there are still people there, but I think these are kind of Pete's lieutenants. Certainly in the case of Russell, Doug Baldwin, KJ, and Bobby, you know, they seem to be the 4 guys that they have a feeling will be able to guide the next group, and are probably not stuck on what happened in the past. A quick note that, yeah, Brandon Marshall is currently the oldest player on the roster. He's a few months older than Tom Johnson, who they signed in free agency, so he is the oldest player. I also think, Kenny, on this, as soon as you brought it up, I'm kind of tired of seeing the old players bring up this the Super Bowl against the Patriots, and I was a little disappointed to see Cliff Averill. I know that these players get asked about it, and then they indulge their interviewers or whoever's speaking to them about this, and they get into detail about it. But I'm kind of tired of hearing this message that people tuned out to Pete Carroll's message afterwards, and, you know, oh, it was a chance to win 2 Super Bowls, and we would have won more if we'd have just, you know, had the right play there. So much could have gone wrong in that situation. I think in the way that people like Cliff spoke this week, it just sounds to me like a large number of this team cut their nose off to spite their face after that Super Bowl. That I understand it would have been really hard to get over it. As fans, it's taken us a long time to get over it. I mean, a lot of us won't be over it. I don't think we ever will be over it. But to let that impact you, what you did in 2015, 16, 17, is just you letting yourself down. I mean, you still had a chance to win 2 or 3 more Super Bowls. The message that you started to question after that Super Bowl enabled you to win the first one in the first place and get to another one the following year. You know, everything about that message from Pete Carroll was working because the results were there. If you're going to tune out of that message because one play didn't work, that's on you. That's your problem. You're at fault there. And for me, if anybody still wants to blame Pete Carroll for that, look at the attitude of these players. That they tuned out because that play didn't work. Everybody said it should have been handed to Marshawn. We all wish it had been handed to Marshawn. I don't think the problem that I personally don't have a problem with the pass in that situation. It's been done to death so many times. You know, they're probably going to have a pass at that point if they wanted to still maximize the 2 future plays. I have a problem with the play that was called. I don't think it was the best pass play to call in that situation. I would have loved to have seen Russell moving around, bootleg or something, to get him into space, to have the option to have a look, run it in if he wants to, throw it away if he wants to. But ultimately, that's what happened. It didn't work. They could have handed the ball to Marshawn Lynch. He could have fumbled the ball. Marshawn Lynch fumbled the ball quite a bit. If people remember, Marshawn Lynch fumbled the ball as he was crossing the goal line against Atlanta in 2012. They judged that the ball broke the plane. But from 1 yard out or 2 yards out, whatever it was, Marshawn Lynch fumbled the ball right on the goal line. It went up in the air. Max Unger caught it, and it was still given as a touchdown. So this, listen, bad things happen in football games. And I know it's difficult to get over. But to hear still the team saying, do you know what, that one play, we would have won 2 more Super Bowls or another Super Bowl after that because we were so good, and that one play ruined everything, and everybody started to question Pete Carroll. That's on the players. I'm losing patience with this philosophy, because if that's genuinely what happened, and if players are now saying that one play cost them, you cost it with your attitude. You should have found a way to draw a line under it, allow that to motivate you, come back even stronger, move on, prove to the world that you were still good enough to win in spite of what happened there. Make it a moot point. Win another Super Bowl. So when I hear it, I kind of start thinking, is it an excuse because they didn't win? Are they covering their arse because they didn't win another Super Bowl? You know what? It's just because of that play. We all lost it. We didn't win another one. It's not because we weren't good enough. It's just because of that one play. Or did it genuinely impact Seattle's ability to win future Super Bowls? And if it did, that's on the players.
Absolutely. So they are still moving forward with some younger players. And Rob, obviously you take a lot of time studying the draft and rookies and college prospects. And, the Seahawks, we've talked a lot about Rashad Penny and of course some of the guys at the top, but some of the guys going in maybe day 3 or undrafted free agency, we can take some time to evaluate them further. You wrote recently about Jamarco Jones, the 6th round tackle that they drafted. And you wrote about how PFF had noted him so much as a 2nd round talent. But he is perhaps one of the most unathletic guys that the Seahawks have drafted, is if I'm to be understood correctly. Can you expand on Jamarco Jones and the disconnect between a player's athleticism and their ability to translate or go above and beyond their athleticism on the field?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of an offensive tackle, it's pretty simple. It's what you'd expect. You're going to come up against the best athletes in the NFL. They're going to rush the edge with speed. You're going to have the elite of the elite rushing the edge there. And if you do not have the quickness to cut off the speed off the edge, then you're going to have some problems. And if you don't have the explosion to win with power and the hand technique, then you may get dominated with upper body strength and explosion as well. So it really is just physics and the fact that the guy that you're coming up against is going to be an elite athlete, so you better be pretty good yourself. And the problem is with Jamarco Jones is that he had a pretty terrible combine. You're talking about numbers that match up with Orlando Brown, who famously had a terrible combine. Even Orlando Brown ran a comprehensively faster 3-cone than Jamarco Jones to kind of emphasize what the issue is there. And he definitely has some physical limitations. And I think you sort of see it in the technique flaws that he has as well. When he locks on to a guy and he can get his hands on them and he can block in front, he's really, really good. I watched 3 games against good opponents. I did not see a single time when a defensive end disengaged, having initiated contact with Jamarco Jones and then beat him with a counter. I just didn't see that. So if he gets his hands on you, it's game over. He'll finish the block, and he plays that edge. He finishes. He's physical, and that is a really appealing thing to see. But because he has this physical limitation, the one thing you kind of see it with Jermaine Ifedi, who doesn't have the physical limitation. I think his is a confidence and technique issue, but he overcompensates. So his kick slide is often too deep, and he will leave the inside rush wide open. I mean, it is there time and time again. You see it too often. He leaves a great big lane between himself and the guard. So what you would see is a USC game, you would see it, and the Iowa game, you would see it. The defensive end would rush to the edge. He would kick slide a little too deep and then just dart inside and get to the quarterback. And I think he's doing that because he doesn't want to get beat off by speed off the edge. But you've got to play inside out. You've got to make sure that guy is beating you off the edge, not giving them an easy route to the quarterback by letting you get beat inside. You've got to play inside out. And the frustrating thing is that he has 35 and 1/8 inch arms. He has got ideal length to play offensive tackle. So just ward him off. You can play inside out. Keep your hands out there. You can run them out the play pretty easily. You give them a shove when they're rushing the edge at full pelt, and you can get them out the play. If not, you can at least buy your quarterback enough time to deliver a pass. So it was a little bit frustrating seeing that flaw. But as I mentioned, when he actually connects, he can finish blocks. I know that PFF like him an awful lot. I did see some quality in terms of run blocking. There was a couple of really nice second-level blocks that I saw. He's not quite as big as you maybe would have liked. I think that one of the things he can do is maybe get into a pro weight program, get a better diet, lose some bad weight, gain some good weight, become more stronger, become quicker, become more agile. And if he does that, I think that there's an opportunity there for him to develop into a good player. I would not personally have graded him as a second-round pick based on what I saw. But I think in the 5th round, he's worth taking that chance on. If he doesn't work out in camp, you can cut him as a 5th-round pick. They've cut 5th-round picks before. It's not a big deal, but there is something to work with there. But I think it's perhaps a project that, you look at where he's in a year's time. It'd be really interesting to see him do like a combine test in 12 months' time to see where he's improved and how he's improved, because I think he certainly is once he gets into a pro weight program. But definitely some things to like, some technical flaws to work on, and some athleticism to be gained, I would say.
And the Seahawks, it's been a little bit of time since the draft, I guess a month, and they've had a little bit of on-field work between the rookie camp and OTAs. And they, like we had been saying before, they had a very interesting draft with a lot of notable players for one reason or another, whether it was Will Dissly or Shaquem Griffin or Trey Flowers or Michael Dixon or Alex McGuff. But between any of these players, has anything in the last month happened to change your opinion, whether it was raising a stock, lowering a stock, taking stock of a player, new information, the way they've reacted in practices, the way the coaches have talked about them, anything at all with any of the draft class, specifically players that the Seahawks have picked, that they use draft picks on for among the rookies, that would change your opinion of them one way or another?
I've not heard anything that would make me feel that way. I mean, I have to say that the one of only 2 opportunities that Pete Carroll has had a chance to do a press conference. He hasn't really had much time to talk about actual football, and I think he actually referenced that in his last press conference, that he'd actually quite like to talk about football, but sadly he spent most of his time talking about other things. And I'd like to hear him talk about these prospects as well. I'd like to have a bit of information on how the rookies have settled in and some of these free agent signings. I've not heard anything that would give me a steer as to. Sometimes you hear Pete and he talks about a certain guy and you just think that's a guy to watch. And last year it was Chris Carson, wasn't it? He almost immediately was talking about how good he looked, and there was just that glint in his eye when he was talking about Chris Carson. And it'd be great to sort of see if there is somebody who already has caught Pete's eye, who he really feels positive about. But I think as I studied the draft class and looked at some of these guys and looked at some of the names involved, I think I feel quite positive about it, just basically looking at who they are. All of these players have got, we're not talking like home run, wow, this guy is perfect. He's going to do this, he's going to do that. But that's never going to be the case, especially when you have as few picks as the Seahawks have and you trade down in the first round. But there's a lot of potential there, and they're going to add to the competition. I think that there's definitely players who can come in and have a big impact quickly. I think from any draft class, you really kind of want to have 3 players who produce for you. And I think there's an opportunity for more than 3 from this class. Rashad Penny's going to compete immediately with Chris Carson, and that could be a really, really dangerous looking double-headed monster at running back. Rasheem Green's going to come in and he's going to be part of that rotation right away. Will Disley could be, by the end of the year, could be really knocking on the door as their number 1 tight end. Ed Dixon's, he's not a long-term signing. He could be, but he doesn't have to be. And if Will Disley's already shown that he's the best tight end on the roster by the end of the year, he could be the number 1, and that could be a major positive for them. And we all want to see Shaquem Griffin and what he can do. I mean, I wish it was training camp and preseason right now. I want to see this guy on the field in a Seahawks uniform. I want to see him rushing the passer and playing the way that he can. The punter sounds intriguing. I mean, there is throughout this class, there are players that for me to sort of show some excitement and some interest in. And I think, look, if there's one player that Pete's talked about, which makes me feel pretty confident and excited, it's the way that he spoke about Trey Flowers. I think he sees something in Trey Flowers in his frame and the way that he's played, albeit at safety at Oklahoma State, that it means he can come in and he can be one of Pete's guys that he coaches up and develops into, hopefully down the road, a starting cornerback. And he definitely is going to be somebody to keep an eye on. There just isn't enough out there to sort of say whether he can and can't play cornerback. So I want to see him playing it. I want to hear the reports from training camp. I want to see him playing in preseason. I want to get a feel for what this guy's all about. So yeah, I think Pete spoke positively about him. He's the one thing maybe so far that's made me think, I've got to see this guy, a little bit more of this guy.
And for some of the undrafted free agents, you have an opportunity to talk about some of those guys that have come in. And I know that the one that I've written about on Field Goals, Poona Ford, is one that you've also written about. And it's notable because of for a number of reasons, but 5'11" height. One of the shortest defensive linemen in the NFL, if not the shortest defensive lineman in the NFL, especially, if he makes the roster this year, even right now, among all the 90-man rosters. I don't know every player on every roster, but 5'11" defensive tackle, defensive line is pretty much going to be right there with the shortest in the NFL. One of the shortest in league history, in fact, especially, in the modern NFL, as players do get bigger. So, hey, look, there were a lot of 5-footers more so in the 30s and 40s. So don't hold me to it. So, but Poona Ford, nobody, it seems like, from what I can understand, really questions Poona Ford's ability as a college football player with his time in Texas and the abilities that he had to play for that team at that time, which was struggling, but had Poona Ford. Would you say that is Poona Ford in the same respect of like a Russell Wilson, where you couldn't really argue against his college pedigree, the things that he had done on the field? Not that Poona Ford was as impactful as Russell Wilson, even when grading on a curve between quarterback and defensive tackle, but just in the fact that, yeah, there was plenty to like about Poona Ford, the defensive tackle at Texas. We just don't think that he's got the height to succeed in the NFL because nobody at this height has succeeded in the NFL. When Russell Wilson came into the NFL in 2012, the best comps that you could create in the last 30 years was Doug Flutie. And that's not a very good quarterback. It's a nice story and he's had some good games, but it's nothing like what we could have expected with what we got from Russell Wilson as fans, to see him come out and play at this level. And not that Poona Ford is going to play at a level or even make an NFL roster. But is it the case that the tape is there, that he's a good player, that teams just fear? that he won't be able to win enough battles because of his height, or does it go beyond that?
Yeah, I think that definitely the NFL looked at him and just saw, the NFL's pretty keen still on conventional wisdom. And when they look at Poona Ford and they say, well, who does he remind you of the NFL? Who does he compare to? And they type his numbers into the database and they see which of the players like him have come into the league, and they probably won't find many. And the ones that they do have not succeeded. And for a reason, a lot of teams probably just took him off the board and said, no, we're not going to, he has to be the exception to the rule. And that was the way that Russell Wilson lasted until round 3, despite everything that he'd done in college. And it's why Poona Ford has ultimately gone drafted. Obviously, there's a very big difference in the two positions. Quarterback, teams more likely to take a chance on a really productive, quality quarterback who had pretty much everything that you looked for, apart from height and Russell Wilson. Poona Ford's a defensive tackle, and you can find them most years. So he's gone undrafted. I think that the tape that I saw was fine. You didn't watch the tape and think, wow, why has this guy not gone in the first 3 rounds because he plays so well? It's just that he's 5'11". You don't see that on the tape. What I will say, though, is that at the Senior Bowl, in the workouts during the week, you saw a lot of splash plays from Poona Ford. And the Senior Bowl cannot be disregarded just that easily. I mean, he's coming up against peers there, people who are going to be in the league. He's coming up against players that are going to get drafted, that are going to possibly go on and become very successful NFL players. He had some great snaps at the Senior Bowl. In the piece that I wrote, I showed a number of videos where he just flat out dominated. There was one play where he really beat Will Hernandez, who went in there. I think it was like the 34th overall pick. There was a number of plays where he just won with leverage and just beat the offensive lineman up and just shoved him into the backfield. He had a really good shrine game, and there was some great action there. There was a real buzz around Poona Ford after the shrine game. So those two bold all-star type of workout sessions, I think really went well for him. And what I like about him, and the reason why I think that he is more than just a short defensive tackle, is that he has 33-inch arms. And that's unusual for a player of his stature, to be a little bit bigger. Usually you would expect to get the length, but he's sort of short, but with the long arms. And Kenny, I get excited about that. I get excited about seeing what he's going to do, because one of the problems that taller defensive tackles have is that it's very easy for offensive linemen, or it's a bit easier for offensive linemen rather, to get into their pads, win with leverage, lower man wins, get in there, jolt them back. And as a defensive tackle, you don't have to beat them with a swim move or a great get off, get into the backfield, have a clean run to the quarterback. All you have to do is shove the guard into the face of the quarterback to impact the play. That's a splash play. You just have to push the guard backwards. If defensive tackles are doing that, they're impacting the game of football. So for taller players, it's difficult for those. If the guards can get into them, the center can get into them, drive them backwards, get them out the play, they're doing their job. So the bigger frame, the easier it is to lose leverage. So he hasn't got that. He hasn't got that sort of big target on his chest saying, punch me here, you're going to drive me out the game. He doesn't have that. But what he does have is the length. So he's not got the target on the chest that the linemen are going to get into, but he's got the length to keep the other guy off. So where are you going to get your hands? How do you get your hands on him? Because he might win them with the longer arms, and he's the short and he's lower. He can get into the pad level. He can jolt the guys back. I don't think that Poona Ford's going to be the type of guy that's like Geno Atkins, who just flying into the backfield. He's not like Aaron Donald, who just wins with quickness and get off, although it does show some of that in the Senior Bowl. But what he could be is somebody who has good gap discipline, because he can keep the lineman off, look to where the running back's going, cover his hole. He could be somebody who just shoves the guard or the center back into the backfield, gets into the quarterback's face and influences the game in that way. And that could make him quite a useful rotational interior defensive lineman. And when you hear people like his college coach at Texas raving about him as a player and saying he's going to be a 10-year pro and all this, yeah, okay, some of that has to be taken with a pinch of salt because he was his coach at Texas and it serves a purpose for him to praise him that way. But I kind of just like, look, he's going way over the top here. So he's either setting this guy up for a major fall, or he's just a really great character, leader, player, talent that we should take interest in. And given that the Seahawks have cut quite a few of their undrafted free agents so far, I think it's interesting the ones that they've kept to be part of the competition. So I'm really looking forward to seeing Poona Ford. And I think he's a player that the league's looking for bigger, faster, stronger, Kenny. The league's changed. It's quicker. The quarterback's getting the ball out faster. There's more spread concepts in the NFL these days. So height length, speed, explosiveness, they're right at the top of the list in terms of what you want in a defensive lineman. Here comes a 5'11" defensive tackle, slightly disrespected, didn't get invited to the combine, went undrafted, but has got unusual length, unique length for his size. He's got a bit of a chip on his shoulder. Sounds like a Seahawks player to me, so I'm really looking forward to seeing him in camp.
We talked about Tyler Lockett. We talked about Brandon Marshall. We don't really need to talk about Doug Baldwin. He's he's locked in as one of the most important players on the team. We know about those three receivers, and we don't know if Brandon Marshall will make the team or not. But we have talked about him, and we've talked about guys in camp. And one of the things that the Seahawks didn't really do was bring in rookie receivers. From what I'm looking at on the full roster, maybe Caleb Scott is a rookie, undrafted free agent. But they've got Baldwin, Lockett, and Marshall. Then past that, Jerron Brown signed as a free agent. He did sign a 2-year deal. So they've got Jerron Brown, Tanner McAvoy, Marcus Johnson, who they acquired from the Philadelphia Eagles in the Michael Bennett trade, David Moore, Amara Darboh, who was a 3rd-round pick last year. Moore was a 7th-round pick. Keenan Reynolds, Demoria Stringfellow, Cyril Grayson, and Caleb Scott. Lots of players there. And in an ideal world, we saw this last year perhaps with the whole Cason Williams situation and drama where people wanted Cason Williams to be kept on the roster over certain other players. And I could see it being difficult for, fans and the Seahawks too, to part ways with one or two of these guys. If things go well, especially considering, with the addition of Brandon Marshall, it gives more competition to Amara Darboh and the fear that could a 3rd-round pick get cut in year 2. David Moore, wanted to see whether or not he can grow. Tanner McAvoy, will he put 2017 behind him and take that next step as one of the most incredible physical specimens at receiver in the NFL? Demoria Stringfellow, all these guys, do you see players out of that group that you have a gut feeling or any other type of feeling that they could increase their stock and be an important part of the offense next year, or players that you think, I just don't see it happening for that guy?
Oh, sure. There's guys there that you could see definitely having a contribution. I think Jerron Brown is a pretty interesting player, 6'3", 204, at a decent age. He only turned 28 this year. He had a better year than I think people realized last season. I mean, look, the numbers are not. I'm not trying to claim that he's Antonio Brown here, but 477 yards, nearly 500 yards, and 4 touchdowns. And if they're having to try and replace the production from Paul Richardson, well, Richardson had 703 yards and 6 touchdowns, so just a couple more touchdowns. 200 more yards. It's worth noting, though, that you could say, Paul Richardson wasn't in a pass-friendly offense. Well, Paul Richardson was in a pass-friendly offense because the Seahawks couldn't run the ball last year, so we had more opportunities to catch the ball. Jerron Brown didn't benefit from Carson Palmer starting because Blaine Gabbert and Drew Stanton had to play a large number of games for Arizona. Their offense was a bit of a mess. They lost David Johnson as well. So I think actually the fact that he had that yardage, it at least hints that he could just transition into the Paul Richardson role and maybe provide a bit of a spark there. We will see. We will find out in good time. I've not seen enough of Marcus Johnson to know whether or not he can also come in and compete there. But that's the great thing again. I think in previous years, Kenny, it's been training camp. You get excited about it every year because it means the NFL season's nearly here. But if we actually look back with hindsight, the most exciting thing we were building up to was stuff like who's going to be the 4th and 5th running back on the roster, who's going to be the last receiver who won't get any catches during the season, but he will be there as opposed to somebody else. Which special team linebacker is going to not take any snaps during the regular season? That's the kind of thing we were talking about legitimately. I mean, that's not, it's kind of a jokey way I put it, but that's what we were deliberating in camp, is that who was going to make the back end of the 53-man roster. Whereas now I think we're talking about huge opportunities. Who's going to be the lead running back? Who are the receivers going to be apart from Doug Baldwin and Tyler Lockett? You know, how is this offensive line going to shake out? That's perhaps a little bit more solid than some other positions, but the rotation on the defensive line, who's going to start at cornerback? I don't think it's a pure done deal that it's Maxwell and Griffin. They will get the inside track, but we wait and see. We see what happens there. You know, there are big things to be determined on this roster. A lot of competition there, a lot to prove in training camp, a lot to prove in preseason. And for that reason, I think it's going to be a very intriguing summer ahead for Seahawks fans.
And, you know, if we wanted to go out on some sort of note, why not with the pass rush? It's always something of interest for every team. It's perhaps the most important, you know, even if it's pass rush or, you know, even if we're talking about pass rush in the context of, do you have a secondary that is strong enough to make the quarterback wait an extra half second or second that gives the opportunity for the defensive line to get to the quarterback, whatever that means. You know, this league is about how can you efficiently pass the football. So it's just as much about how can you efficiently stop, or how can you make the opposing quarterback less efficient at passing the football. For the Seahawks, losing Michael Bennett, Cliff Averill, and Sheldon Richardson, it's perhaps the most talent any team has lost on the defensive line in the NFL now, perhaps the most talent that any team has lost on the defensive line in many years. You know, it's a lot of talent. Sheldon Richardson, an all-pro in his own right. Michael Bennett at his time, you know, could be considered an all-pro. Cliff Averill, you know, one of the greatest pass rushers that we've had in the last couple of years, last 5-6 years, especially in terms of forcing fumbles and getting in there and being disruptive. Lots of talent, but the Seahawks, you know, they're not talent poor. They just have a lot of potential right now between Frank Clark, who has to be the, you know, the veteran leader now to the defensive line, to Rasheem Green, the 20-year-old, Nazir Jones, who a lot of people liked last year, Jaron Reed, perhaps one of the fastest rising defensive tackles in the NFL, Deion Jordan getting a second or third or fourth or 15th chance, but certainly with 4 sacks in 5 games last year, someone that a lot of people are keeping an eye on. And then the unknowns with Malik McDowell and, you know, some of these other guys like Tom Johnson, who you mentioned before, Shamar Stephen, re-signing Marcus Smith, Quentin Jefferson, who was the 5th-round pick that they traded up to get, you know, from using another pick from a future year to get Quentin Jefferson. So they clearly liked him. And Brandon Jackson, who was, you know, effective in small limited duty in previous seasons. So with the defensive line, you know, Rob, how do you feel about any one of these guys, especially considering that they have to make decisions on how to pay, or if they're going to pay Deion Jordan and Frank Clark? Any qualms about giving Frank Clark a long-term extension now before the season begins? The same goes for Deion Jordan and whether or not it's okay to extend him, because certainly it seems, and would you agree that the worst case scenario is that the Seahawks are 1 year away from losing Clark, losing Jordan, or paying Frank Clark, you know, $18 million on a franchise tag and figuring that whole situation out. Thoughts on the pass rush and who to extend and what to move forward there with?
Well, a couple of thoughts here. I think with Frank Clark, it's a very difficult one to work out what is the best route to go with, because undoubtedly the pass rush has become a very premium position. It's become a very expensive position. You are almost certainly going to end up spending a high salary. You know, you're not going to get the kind of, the Seahawks managed to get Michael Bennett on quite a cheap deal for the last 2 contracts that they, or 3, I suppose, if you can include the one that they got him on the initial 1-year deal. They managed to get him at quite a bargain price, but that was unusual. You know, you're usually going to end up spending an awful lot of money. So you have to determine whether or not you think that Frank Clark has shown enough to warrant the massive investment, knowing that once he is paid, he's going to be paid probably higher than anybody other than Russell Wilson. So are you comfortable with Frank Clark potentially being the second highest paid player on the team for the next 3 years, 4 years, whatever? Is that, do you see further growth once he's been paid, or do you think that he might regress a little bit, having been given a fortune to spend? Can you get him on the type of salary if you sign him now as opposed to next year that Everson Griffin got with the Minnesota Vikings. His average salary is only $14.5 million, which seems quite reasonable in comparison to a lot of other pass rushers. His cap hit this year is only $11.6 million. It's not 17.5 or 20 million or whatever Aaron Donald's going to get. So if you do a deal now, do you get a bit of a discount versus needing to franchise? I mean, you definitely don't want to franchise him because the top end of the defensive end market is so high that he would be, from that point, the negotiations begin. So you probably gonna have to make him the highest paid defensive end at the most highest paid position other than quarterback next year, which I just don't see the franchise tag as a solution here. So if you pay him now, do you get a discount versus waiting to see what he does this year and then pay him? And the other thing you have to include in this, Kenny, is the history that led to him falling to the late second round in the first place. You know, a team's going to be a little bit wary of paying Frank Clark because of that. It's a possibility. You know, teams might. The Seahawks drafted him. A lot of other teams probably didn't have him on their draft board at the time and may feel uncomfortable paying him millions and millions and millions and millions and having to deal with some of the stuff that the Seahawks dealt with when they simply drafted him in the late second round. And for that reason, they might be better off just sort of letting this situation play out. Let him play another year. Let him test the market. See what the opportunity is in a year's time. So it's a very difficult situation. It's not a. I personally don't feel like I've got an answer to that. Like, I don't know what the best thing is to do right now. I can sort of see arguments for waiting. I can see an argument for paying him. I think it's a very difficult one for the Seahawks to judge at this point. As for the pass rush in general, I think that it's undoubtedly probably it's undoubtedly their biggest need. Let's just go with that. It's undoubtedly their biggest need. You look at the team, and we've come to rely on Bennett and Averill being there. Frank Clark was a lovely third option, third wheel to that. Chris Clemens was there in the past. You know, they brought in Sheldon Richardson. They drafted Malik McDowell. You know, a year ago, you feel pretty good about the pass rush. Now you're kind of thinking, well, it's looking weak. You know, you've lost Richardson, you've lost McDowell. Probably you've definitely lost Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill. It's looking a little less secure, and there's perhaps not that top tier proven talent that you'd love to have on the defensive line. Clark's very good. Could become even better. Has the potential to be one of the best pass rushers in the league. Hasn't realized it yet. Let's hope that happens this year. I think that with Naz Jones, he's shown some potential. Dion Jordan's shown a lot of potential. You hope that Jaron Reed can continue. So it's not that there's a bad group. It's just that there's not that kind of like real loaded Philadelphia Eagles style. Oh, we're going to throw 7 guys at you, and here comes a fresh pair of legs, and he's going to terrorize you now. And you don't have that star like Aaron Donald. You don't have the big names. But one other thing I would say is that in 2012, the Seahawks basically had Chris Clemens and Bruce Irvin, and before that, they had Chris Clemens, and that was kind of enough to be competitive. And perhaps that's what they're relying on now. Maybe Frank Clark is Chris Clemens and he gets 12 sacks, and the rest do just enough. Maybe Deion Jordan's Raheem Brock, and as a duo, they can get you by until next offseason, when maybe there'll be someone in free agency that you want to sign, or it's going to be a really good draft for defensive linemen in a year's time, Kenny. Maybe in a year's time, you get that defensive lineman in the first round and you feel a lot better about this group, and you re-sign Frank Clark, and you're cooking on gas and you're moving forward again. But right now you look at it and you're hoping that certain players, Deion Jordan, Marcus Smith, Rasheem Green, can have an impact. But overall, the depth and perhaps the talent isn't quite there. Competition is, but the other two maybe not.
Well, it's an interesting time for the Seahawks, no doubt. Lots of change from the last few years, and talking about all the new coaches and the pass rush. I agree. It was the biggest need, I think, going into the draft for sure, and the offseason, and that's usually true. You know, getting better on the offensive and defensive lines, it's almost always going to ring true, and that there always can be more. Better help at starting positions, better depth behind those guys. And for the Seahawks, you know, right now they seem to have a lot of good potential on the defensive line, but, you know, lacking proven talent, lacking that knowledge that, as you say, Frank Clark, the third wheel, can be Frank Clark, the unicycle. So we'll see what happens with the Seahawks there. And that's it for this episode of Seahawks Chats. You can follow Rob Staton at SeahawksDraftBlog.com for great insight on the Seattle Seahawks, both the current NFL roster, as well as some players to look forward to in the 2019 draft. The rookies this year, go back and read on some of what Rob has written about them, including the guys we talked about today, like Poona Ford and Jamarco Jones. And you can find plenty there on Rashad Penny and Will Dissly and so on. And follow him on Twitter at Rob Staton. You can find us on Twitter at Field Goals and at fieldgoals.com, of course. We would like you to support the show, with Patreon. If you'd like, patreon.com/fieldgoals. If you're interested in supporting the show so that it can continue running. And if you're interested in sponsorship, you can reach out to me on Twitter or email or whatever you feel like, if you're interested in sponsoring the show to keep it running that way. So that's it for this week's Seahawks Chats. It's not so much a draft week, so I wouldn't call it 3,000 NFL mock draft necessarily, but that's it for this episode of whatever this is. Tune back another time, which was indeterminate, for a different episode that'll be about something of which I do not know.